Gracias por continuar con nosotros. Seguimos en esta interesante plática con Michael Schmidt. Michael, you're visiting Mexico right now because we know you're coming here to train a group of students in reporting, in being a journalist, an activist and a journalist. What can you tell us about this workshop?
The workshop is an extended version to a degree of what we already run in South Africa in terms of our conflict reporting masterclass, with the main exception that there's only one facilitator instead of a group of experienced journalists. But in essence, my starting point is for us to recognize that for a journalist to be covering conflict, they don't need to be a so-called war correspondent. In fact, a lot of people the real hardcore guys who work in Iraq and Afghanistan, etc., when you speak to them, very few of them actually describe themselves as war correspondents. They just see themselves as journalists doing their jobs. And the fact of the matter is that any journalist doing their job on a regular basis is going to come into conflict in one form or another. The sad fact is that over the last 10 years, more journalists have been killed at home in peacetime covering their regular beats than have been killed in actual open warfare. I remember a couple of years ago, the bullfighting correspondent in Bogota was killed. He was assassinated because of stories that he'd written about corruption in the bullfighting industry. Now, this is the kind of conflict that people often don't see as conflict because it's not an open war. You've obviously got some pretty dramatic conflict going on in Sonora to the north of here, northwest of here. But you don't have to be in the middle of a Mara gang war in order to be in conflict. There might be a demonstration outside the city hall that turns violent because the police unleash rubber bullets or whatever. You live in a part of the world where two countries went to war over a soccer match. Conflict has many different roots, and it's not always the obvious ones. So all journalists need to be prepared to know that they are going to be operating in a conflict situation. The conflict is not always open. The conflict is sometimes, it's under the surface, it's subsumed. It's not necessarily always violent. But those conflicts that operate under the surface need to be tracked and monitored because they can explode at any one moment. And journalists, if they're really performing their proper role for the public, need to be tracking those and informing the public about what's going on under the surface. So we start from the basic assumption that we live within a world of conflict and that journalists need to pay attention to that and to pay attention to their own safety as well. And secondly, then the most important point I want to bring across is this whole concept of operating ethically within those conflicts in a non-partisan manner and paying very close attention to the fact that the people who assist you, which is your fixers, but also your interviewees, the people who dare to speak out, who dare to speak to a journalist in a conflict situation. You're going to walk away at the end of the day, and that person is left living in that situation. It's really important for the journalist to take responsibility for their interviews and realize that that person may be at risk because of what they said to you afterwards, and it may even be several years down the line. You can't obviously take care of everything, but I've got a good friend who's a journalist who, one of the people who he interviewed was assassinated a couple of weeks later, and he still hasn't shaken that, and no journalist wants to be in that situation with that life on their conscience.
So part of the work you're going to do with students, it's how to transmit that information and also give them tools to be able to report in that certain way?
Yes, indeed. There's a wide range of, essentially the methodology is one of a conversation. I mean, we're adults here. I'm not teaching children. So what I really want to do is I want to draw out of them what their experiences are of conflict in working within Mexican society, living here within society in Guadalajara, and then compare how I've dealt with conflicts in my own society and in others that I've worked within, and see where we can come up with some good ground rules, good rules of thumb, ways of operating, because I've made mistakes as well myself, and I don't want to repeat that, and there's no point in them repeating it if I've figured out that there's something that doesn't work or that is dangerous. So may as well not let them make the same mistakes.
Good. We know you're working, putting together the Professional Journalists Association in South Africa. Can you explain what the association is doing?
The association is essentially stepping in to fill a void, a rather unusual void that has developed in South African journalism. Essentially, we don't have a national professional body that represents the interests of journalists. We've got a body, South African National Editors Forum, that represents the interests of editors, but editors, to be fair to them, do not spend much time, in fact, editing. They spend half their time arguing with advertising and distribution, etc. They really are operating at a structural and management level. We really need a body that represents the interests of the people who do the footwork out in the field and who work within our newsrooms in support of those people. So both journalists, photographers, sub-editors, etc., layout artists. Strangely enough, we are the only country in the region that does not have a functioning national body. And this is the result of the collapse of its predecessor several years ago due to mismanagement. So we've essentially come up with this initiative to try and establish a new national body and again try and avoid the mistakes of the past by structuring it in such a way that it really does serve its membership properly.
Let me ask you one final question. You as an activist playing this role of a journalist, what do you think is the most important challenge you're facing right now?
As an activist and journalist, yes, in South Africa, I guess reporting on the transition in ways that are both progressive and illuminating, but also fair and judicious. Obviously, I've got a certain way of thinking and a certain ideal outcome in certain situations. I'd like to see certain things happen, certain types of development come out of, let's say, the 2010 World Cup next year in South Africa. I'd like to see it benefit the poor people directly. I'd like to see it be sustainable in terms of the infrastructure that we develop. I don't want to see white elephant stadiums sitting around 10 years from now that are empty and that are really museum pieces. But I might not get my wishes, but it's important for me to engage with this debate in a way that tries to highlight the issues, but at the same time recognize the realities. It's a balance, always a balance.
Always a balance. Michael, we want to thank you for your time, for visiting Mexico. We hope you enjoy your time here. We know you're staying to visit also and to experience the Day of the Dead. We hope that's a good experience for you. We really appreciate your time. Thank you very much for being here at Tecnológico de Monterrey. We're sure the students will enjoy the workshop, and we will make sure that our students become very responsible journalists or activists too. Thank you.
Good to hear it. Thank you.
Gracias por su presencia en este programa panorámico, una producción del Tecnológico de Monterrey, Campus Guadalajara y transmitido por Canal 7. Los esperamos nuevamente.